The Dark is Rising, Part 2, The Learning, Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve. It was the day when the delight of Christmas really took fire in the Stanton family. Hints and glimmerings and promises of special things which had flashed in and out of life for weeks before now suddenly blossomed into a constant glad expectancy. The house was full of wonderful baking smells from the kitchen, in a corner of which Gwen could be found putting the final touches to the icing of the Christmas cake. Her mother had made the cake 3 weeks before, the Christmas pudding 3 months before that. Ageless, familiar Christmas music permeated the house whenever anyone turned on the radio. The television set was never turned on at all. It had become, for this season, an irrelevance. For Will, the day brought itself into natural focus very early. Straight after breakfast, an even more haphazard affair than usual. There was the double ritual of the Yule log and the Christmas tree. Mr. Stanton was finishing his last piece of toast. Will and James stood on either side of him at the breakfast table, fidgeting. Their father held a crust forgotten in one hand, and as he pored over the sports page of the newspaper. Will, too, was passionately interested in the fortunes of the Chelsea Football Club, but not on Christmas Eve morning. "Would you like some more toast, Dad?" he said loudly. Said Mr. Stanton. "Ah." James said, "Have you had enough tea, Dad?" Mr. Stanton looked up, turned his round, mild-eyed head from one to the other of them and laughed. He put down the paper, drained his teacup, and crammed the piece of toast into his mouth. "Come on, then," he said indistinctly, taking each of them by an ear. They howled happily and ran for boots and jackets and scarves. Down the road with the handcart they went, Will, James, Mr. Stanton, and tall Max, bigger than his father, bigger than anyone, with his long dark hair jutting in a comical fringe out of a disreputable old cap. What would Maggie Barnes think of that, Will wondered cheerfully, when she peeped roguishly as usual round the kitchen curtain to catch Max's eye, and then in the same instant he remembered about Maggie Barnes, and he thought in a rush of alarm, "Farmer Dawson is one of the old ones. He must be warned about her," and he was distraught that he had not thought of it before. They stopped in Dawson's yard, old George Smith coming out to meet them with his gaping grin. The going had been easier along the road that morning since a plough had been through, but everywhere the snow still lay unmoving in a constant grey windless cold. "Got your tree to beat all," old George called joyfully. "Straight as a mast, like farmers, both royal trees, I reckon." "Royal as they come," said Mr. Dawson, pulling his coat tight round him as he came out. He meant it literally, Will knew. Every year a number of Christmas trees were sold from the Crown plantations round Windsor Castle, and several came back in the Dawson's farm lorry to the village. "Morning, Frank," said Mr. Stanton. "Morning, Roger," said Farmer Dawson, and beamed at the boys. "Hey, lads, round the back with that cart." His eyes slid impersonally over Will, without so much as a flicker of notice. But Will had deliberately left his jacket swinging open in such a way that it was plain there were now 2 cross-circled signs on his belt, not 1. "Good to see you looking so lively, Mr. Dawson," said Mr. Dawson breezily to them all as they heaved the handcart round behind the barn, and his hand rested briefly on Will's shoulder, with a faint pressure that told him Farmer Dawson had a good idea of what had been happening in the last few days. He thought of Maggie Barnes and searched hastily for words to frame a warning. "Where's your girlfriend, Max?" he said carefully, loud and clear. "Girlfriend?" said Max indignantly, being deeply involved with a blonde-dressed student at his London art school from whom enormous blue enveloped letters arrived in the post every day. He was totally uninterested in all local girls. "Ho, ho, ho," said Will, trying hard. "You know!" Fortunately, James was fond of this kind of thing and joined in with enthusiasm. "Maggie, Maggie, Maggie," he chanted gaily. "Oh, Maggie, the dairy-maid sweet on Maxie, the great artist. Ooh!" Max punched him in the ribs, and he lapsed into snorting giggles. "Young Maggie's had to leave us," Mr. Dawson said coldly. "Illness in the family. Needed at home." Pardon me. She packed up and went early this morning. Sorry to disappoint you, Max. I'm not disappointed, said Max, turning scarlet. It's just these stupid little... Ooh, sang James, dancing about out of arm's length. Ooh, poor Maxie lost his Maggie. Will said nothing. He was satisfied. The tall fir tree, its branches tied down with bands of hairy white string, was loaded onto the handcart, and with it the gnarled old root of a beech tree that Farmer Dawson had cut down earlier that year, split in half and put aside to make Yule logs for himself and the Stantons. It had to be the root of a tree, not a branch, Will knew, though nobody had ever explained why. At home they would put the log on the fire tonight, as in the big brick fireplace in the living room, and it would burn slowly all evening until they went to bed. Somewhere, stored away, was a piece of last year's Yule log, saved to be used as kindling for its successor. Here, old George said at the gate. Or, here, old George said, appearing suddenly at Will's side as they all pushed the cart out of the gate. You should have some of this. He thrust forward a great bunch of holly, heavy with berries. Very good of you, George, said Mr. Stanton. But we do have that big holly tree by the front door, you know. If you know anyone who hasn't. No, you take it. The old man wagged his finger. Not half so many berries on that bush of yours. Particular holly this is. He laid it carefully on the cart, then quickly broke off a sprig and slipped the loop into the top buttonhole of Will's coat. And a good protection against the dark, the old voice said low in Will's ear, if pinned over the window and over the door. Then the pink-gummed grin split his creased brown face in a squawk of ancient laughter, and the old one was old George again, waving them away. Happy Christmas! Happy Christmas, George! When they carried the tree ceremonially through the front door, the twins seized it with crossboards and screwdrivers to give it a base. At the other end of the room, Mary and Barbara sat in a rustling sea of colored paper, cutting it into strips, red, yellow, blue, green, and gluing them into interlocking circles for paper chains. You should have done those yesterday, Will said. They'll need time to dry. You should have done them yesterday, said Mary resentfully, tossing back her long hair. It's supposed to be the youngest's job. I cut up lots of strips the other day, Will said. We used those up hours ago. I did cut them all the same. Besides, Barbara said peaceably, he was Christmas shopping yesterday, so you'd better shut up, Mary, or he might decide to take your present back. Mary muttered, but subsided, and Will half-heartedly stuck a few paper chains together. But he kept his eye on the doorway, and when he saw his father and James appear with their arms full of old cardboard boxes, he slipped away after them. Nothing could keep him from the decorating of the Christmas tree. Out of the boxes came all the familiar decorations that would turn the life of the family into a festival for 12 nights and days. The golden-haired figure for the top of the tree, the strings of jewel-colored lights. Then there were the fragile glass Christmas tree balls, lovingly preserved for years, half-spheres whirled like red and gold-green seashells, slender glass spheres, spider-webs of silvery glass threads and beads on the dark limbs of the tree that hung gently turned shimmering. There were other treasures then, little gold stars and circles of plaited straw, light, swinging silver paper balls. Next, a medley of decorations made by assorted Stanton children, ranging from Will's infant pipe-cleaner reindeer to a beautiful filigree cross that Max had fashioned out of copper wire in his first year at art school. Then there were strings of tinsel to be draped across any space, and then the box was empty. But not quite. Riffling his fingers gingerly through the crumbled handfuls of packing paper in an old cardboard container nearly as tall as himself, Will found a small, flat box, not much larger than his hand. It rattled. "What's this?" he said curiously, trying to open the lid. "Good heavens!" said Mrs. Stanton from her central armchair. "Let me see that a moment, love. Is it? Yes, it is. Was it in the big box? I thought we lost it years ago. Just look at this, Roger. See what your youngest son's found. It's Frank Dawson's box of letters." She pressed the catch on the lid of the box so that it flicked up, and Will saw inside a number of ornate little carvings done in some light wood that he could not name. Mrs. Stanton held one up, a carved letter S, with the beautifully detailed head and scaly body of a snake, twirling on an almost invisible thread, then another, an arched M, with peaks like twin spires of a fairy cathedral. The carvings were so delicate that it was quite impossible to see where they joined the threads from which they hung. Mr. Stanton came down from the step-ladder and poked one gentle finger into the box. "Well, well," he said, "clever old Will! I've never seen them before," said Will. "Well, you have, really," his mother said, "but it was so long ago that you wouldn't remember. They disappeared years and years ago. Fancy them being at the bottom of that old box all the time." "But what are they?" "Christmas tree ornaments, of course," said Mary, peering over her mother's shoulder. "Farmer Dawson made them for us," Mrs. Stanton said. "They're beautifully carved, as you see, and exactly as old as the family. On our first Christmas day at the house, Frank made an R for Roger," she fished it out, "and an A for me." Mr. Stanton pulled out 2 letters, both hung together from the same thread. "Robin and Paul. This pair came a bit later than usual. We hadn't been expecting twins. Really, Frank was awfully good. I wonder if he has time for anything like this now." Mrs. Stanton was turning the small wooden curlicues in her thin, strong fingers. "M for Max and M for Mary. Frank was very cross for having a repeat, I remember. Oh, Roger," she said, her voice suddenly softening, "look at this one." Will stood beside his father to look. It was a letter T, carved like an exquisite little tree spreading 2 branches wide. "T," he said, "but none of us begins with T." "That was Tom," his mother said. "I don't really know why I've never spoken to you younger ones about Tom. It was just so long ago. Tom was your little brother who died. He had something wrong with his lungs, a disease some new babies get, and he only lived for 3 days after he was born. Frank had the initial already carved for him because it was our first baby. We had 2 names chosen, Tom if it was a boy, Tess if it was a girl." Her voice sounded slightly muffled, and Will suddenly regretted finding the letters. He patted her shoulder awkwardly. "Never mind, Mum," he said. "Oh, gracious," said Mrs. Stanton briskly. "I'm not sad, love. It was a very long while ago. Tom would have been a grown-up man by now, older than Stephen, and after all—" She gave a comical look round the room, cluttered with people and boxes. "A brood of 9 should be enough for any woman." "You can say that again," said Mr. Stanton. "It comes of having farming forebears, Mum," said Paul. "They believed in large families, lots of free labor." "Speaking of free labor," said his father, "where have James and Max gone?" "Fetching the other boxes." "Good Lord, such initiative." "Christmas spirit," said Robin from the step-ladder. "Good Christian men rejoice and all that. Why doesn't someone turn some music on?" Barbara, sitting on the floor beside her father, took the little carved wooden T from her hand and added it to a row she had made on the carpet of every initial in order. "Tom, Steve, Max, Gwen, Robin and Paul, me, Mary, James," she said. "But where's the W with the Will? Where's the W for Will?" "Will's there with all the rest in the box." There wasn't a W, actually, if you remember," said Mr. Stanton. "It was a kind of pattern, I dare say. Frank had got tired of doing initials by then." He grinned at Will. "But it's not here," Barbara said. She held the box upside down and shook it. Then she looked at her younger brother solemnly. "Will," she said, "you don't exist."